Welcome to another episode of the Divine Counsel Worldview podcast. We're going to be handling Genesis 13 today. Well, actually, we have to finish chapter 12, Mike, so let's do that. I'd like to get us going this time by summarizing where we've been. Genesis 1 through the first part of 12. A lot of water's gone through the bridge there, so gone under the bridge. So I'd like to just kind of back up and stop and see how we're doing. And then this will lead to a question that, again, I've not told you I'm thinking of yet, so it'll be dropped on you kind of off the cuff. 5 ideas that I want to just begin with that leads then to a question. Number 1, Genesis 12, 1-3, which we handled last time, where God calls Abraham out of Ur and says, you're heading off to a land that you do not know. That presumes a conversion of worship pattern. And if anything that should be caught out of Genesis 12, even beyond verses 1-3 and that great promise, it's ideas that Abraham from Joshua 24:2 stopped worshiping the gods of Babylon and converted. This would be a literal conversion as we use that term. And so when we see him building an altar and then calling upon the name of Yahweh, this is 12:8, which is the second time that phrase is used after 426. And so again, if the second time something is said is almost more important than the first time something is said, I think what the reader or listener would have caught was that Abraham is doing what the earth should have been doing since 426, and that is worship Yahweh. And again, the name Yahweh, I don't think, and this is just my view, there's a lot of debate on this, but the idea that they knew the name Yahweh, my guess would be they don't know the name until Exodus 6. But at this point, he is worshiping the Creator God, and he has left the land of Ur. Number 2, again, just as way of review where we've been, we should also presume, alternatively, that this God, Yahweh, will become the patron deity of Abraham. And by patron deity, I'm speaking in their terms. In other words, a God of someone. So you'll hear the phrase God of Abraham or God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. I am with you, that kind of language. That's what they would call in ancient religious study, shall we call it, a patron deity. And that's kind of what I think we can do now with this relationship between God and Abraham. Number 3, thus this is, and for their worldview, this would have been a shocking idea, this is a movable God who is powerful in any land or territory. So like in 28:15, he says, at that point, I think it's to Isaac, I am with you wherever you go. That's a stunning idea for this world, that you could take your God with you. And then powerful enough even to displace the gods into a land that you go. So, or did I say that right? When you head into a land, and then God will say, like in Deuteronomy 4, looking way ahead, God will tell Moses and the people that I will displace these people in front of you. That's a huge idea that, again, would have been shocking to that world. Number 4, then, loyalty on, and here we're getting into 12 through 15, moving through the story. Loyalty on the part of Abraham's family will be an individual and not just a tribal matter. Now, could we telegraph that from Genesis 12? I don't know, but certainly based on how the story is going, where Noah was identified as an individual who was righteous in Genesis 7:1, that kind of moment in the story, looking backwards, where God or the writer identifies an individual as righteous and not just a tribe for worshiping the right deity, shall we say. It's easy in our worldview then, and I think even now, for people to hide in their religious tradition. Their family worships a certain deity or whatever. But I think what's coming out of the biblical story rather early, so that it really can't be missed, or certainly will make sense later, in that is the idea of an individual loyalty to a deity, even beyond that of your tribe. Okay. And so we should be watching. And here's again what I'd recommend. This is my take on Genesis, and we'll see how our listenership takes this. But I think the story of Genesis will be asking us to look for that individual who identifies with Yahweh, as opposed to the individual who maybe the text doesn't come right out and say they have not worshiped Yahweh, but from all indications of the story, we actually have that as the theme, that here's an individual who, even though, let's say, he's within the tribe of Abraham, he does not worship Yahweh. And then number 5, and this will kind of bring in my question that I'm going to throw at you, Mike, is the largest framing. Here's my point in review. The largest framing story so far in Genesis 12 is not how sin is handled, or how we need a savior from sin, nor even the coming of a Messiah, but it's looking at it. It's asking which God both created and thus runs the world, and how we align with that deity. So, when I say it that way, I'm nervous because, again, I look across my library for any book that says that, and maybe I'm myopic. Maybe I can't see what's right in front of my face. But here's my question: is it fair to say, Mike, that the common way we summarize the story of the Bible, which is, and again, I could pick any number of Old Testament intros off my shelf, is usually we'll see it as creation, crisis, covenant. That order: creation, Genesis 1; crisis, Genesis 3; covenant, Genesis 12. But is it fair to swap those last two and say that really, when you get into the story, and now I'm going to expand our horizons because we've read the whole Bible, is it fair to say that the story really is creation, covenants, plural, and then crisis? Switch those last two, because here's my thought, and again, I just throw it to you, that what we have coming out of Genesis 10 and 11 is a series of covenants made between humans and deities, epitomized by the Tower of Babel. And that the story of sin management really hasn't hit yet. That, if we're wanting to see temples and priests and sacrifices, we're going to have to wait thousands of years, literally, until we get to Moses in order to get that kind of a story going. What we have at this early juncture of human history is a creation, a creator. Then we have covenants being cut between humans and deities. And now in 12 and on, we will have a series of, if not one major crisis, and that, of course, being the idolatry that leads the nation into exile. I'll leave it there. What do you think? Maybe I should ask it this way: am I misreading our evangelical framework, where I can't find any writer who frames it that way, that it goes creation, covenants, plural, and crisis. And maybe I'm asking too much, but to me, this is a divine counsel worldview 101. That's what I'm saying, is that if we believe in a divine counsel, one of the things that comes out of that belief pretty early on is watch for these beings to have covenants with humans, and humans to reciprocate back and forth, which will then cause the crises, plural, to happen, if not for the biggest crisis of all. Of course, that is the exile. So that's a big introduction, but I throw it to you, Mike, for your thoughts.
So this is just a hot take, because you definitely did not prepare me.
We're sitting over a coffee cup, Mike. That's all we're doing here.
Yeah, that's pretty much what we're doing. I will say, so let me frame it, right? Because I think for those in the audience, there's a lot of people who are listening, and I'm guessing where some of their theological or their church, family background might be, is coming from a tradition where the story of the Bible is not even seen in covenants. The story of the Bible is seen in revelations or like dispensations. Sure. And so the concept of the importance of covenants is not as emphasized from that kind of theological framework. Right?
Now, by covenants, are you talking about the traditional Abraham or Edenic, Noahic, Abrahamic, Davidic, New, all that kind of thing? I was talking covenants in the sense of people making covenants individually with deities, and nations making covenants with deities. That's what I mean.
I understand where you're going, but I think even for those who I think that's the challenge, right? Is that overall just the idea of what a covenant is unfamiliar for a lot of people, especially if they're coming from like a Christian background, but a background that emphasizes more on special revelation, right? That it's kind of funny though. The first time I ever heard the dichotomy between covenant theology versus a dispensationalist theology, the person humorously pointed out that covenant theology famously, typically has like 7 covenants, like 7 major covenants they like to think of. And then dispensationalists thought, oh, we should totally match that because we have the number 7. And so we have 7 dispensations. And so you have that's going on. But I do like the way that you put it in that covenants is as I got through in my studies at Gordon, I realized more and more how important covenants, not just with people groups, but as you're saying, individuals with other individuals or individuals with their gods were. Like it's just not something that's really talked much about in more pop theology or folk theology within the churches, right? Because we are living in a culture where we don't. The only time we ever maybe hear the word covenant is when we're at a wedding, at a wedding ceremony.
And sometimes in covenant churches, we talk about the covenants. And again, we're talking probably Abrahamic and Davidic and the new covenant, things like that. And I wasn't going there at all. I was just talking in terms of what's the big problem. If the Abrahamic story, Genesis 12 and on, is solving a problem, if God's up to something, what is he doing? What is he up to? What problem is he potentially solving? And my answer to that so far as a Divine Council worldview enthusiast is that he's solving the problem of human worship that has gone afoul, worshiping other deities. So,
well, and I think there is a way to even take a look at like the Abrahamic covenant that most folks would generally think is like a very big group covenant. But even at that moment in Genesis 12, years ago back when I was still going to my old, Chinese Heritage Church, my associate pastor, he introduced this idea that has stayed with the church ever since, which is going back to Genesis 12, verse 2 and verse 3. I will bless those who bless you. I will curse him who curses you. In you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. And he introduced this idea to our church so many years ago that we as Christians who are inheritors of Abraham's faith, we are blessed ultimately to be a blessing to the nations. Mm-hmm. And like the way I see it is like you can go down to the individual level that through this one man's loyalty to Yahweh, that by Yahweh's blessing of him, the nations, the people groups will be blessed through him.
Well, that's how, I was just thinking as you say that, as you go to Revelation, and pardon me turning to my Bible here, you can probably hear me doing it. If you go to the very end of the story, Revelation 22:2, the leaves of the tree in the garden, there in the final garden, were for the healing of the nations. That the story is not, again, what I hate to call, but that's really what I'm sensing is sin management, that if I can get rid of my sin or get it forgiven the right way, that I get to go to heaven. The story of Scripture seems to be the healing of what happened at Babel, that we're going to undo Babel. And that would be, and Mike was big about this, Dr. Heiser, the idea that Pentecost was the undoing of Babel. Things like that are brilliant. And I totally subscribe to that. And so if that's the halftime, right, Pentecost, well, then that makes the end, the healing of the nations, and thus the beginning. Abraham somehow is healing the nations through his call and his obedience to that call. So I was just thinking of this week. This is old now. I have the May-June 2022 Christianity Today in my hands. And what caught my eye was an article on the Nephilim. Wow, we got an article on the Nephilim in Christianity Today. But as you get to the end, here's how this is the opening paragraph the opening first 2 paragraphs of the last section of the article as he was closing up. In a way, the two most common theories of the Nephilim and the sons of God, which he offered the Seth view and the divine view, both offer important lessons. Genesis makes clear that there have always been two groups of people, those who fear God and those who rebel, those who live in the way of Seth and those who live in the way of Cain, the righteous and the unrighteous. Even the good seed gets corrupted. This is the story of the Old Testament. Who among its procession of characters is righteous enough to save humanity? Not Seth, not Enoch, not even Noah, who fell into sin, not even Abraham, who lied about his wife and had a child with his servant, not even David, who exploited Bathsheba. Failure is the story of God's people in the Old Testament, and it's our story as well. We all fall short of righteousness. Romans 3:10, there is none righteous, no, not one. He drops in other words, right back to a sin management story based on the Nephilim story. And I was stunned by that, how you can take a story that's clearly not about sin management to me. I mean, Genesis 6 is talking about the invasion of these deities to our earth, and probably making covenants with humans along the way. I think that's the background to that. And yet to turn that whole story into a none righteous, no, not one, shows me that the author is looking for something and finding it in a way that I guess that was my opening thought as a question is, how come we have so quickly turned these stories into sin management? And maybe there's no simple answer, and I don't want to put you on the spot like that because I don't think you agree with it either. But it's just stunning to me that we have, as a landscape across the theological world, even as we go to Genesis 12, and I think we can open there now, it's just stunning to me how we can take stories. Let's, in fact, begin with this, Genesis 12, 10 to 20. We never got there last time. And I'm not going to read it, but it's the story of Abraham going down to Egypt. Let's just begin at 12:10. Now there was a famine in the land. Abraham again is journeying near Bethel in verse 8, and he's renting, right? He's a sojourner. He does not own land. He doesn't have any children yet. Can God change the world through a refugee, a childless refugee and his wife? Really is kind of the opening thought here, the opening question. And as verse 10, now there was a famine in that land of Canaan, and Abraham went down to Egypt to sojourn there, for the famine that was severe in the land. It came to pass when he was close to entering Egypt that he said to Sarai his wife, indeed, I know that you are a woman of beautiful countenance. And she's 65, but she must have still been good-looking enough to cause this story to happen. Therefore, it will happen when the Egyptians see you, they will say, this is his wife, and they'll kill me. And so he tells her to lie and say, you are my sister, so that I may live because of you. I'm not going to read the rest, but we know that he's taken into Pharaoh's house. Pharaoh treats Abraham well for the woman's sake, but God, Yahweh plagued. This is the key verse to me, 12:17. The Lord plagued Pharaoh and his house with great plagues because of Sarai, Abraham's wife. And Pharaoh called Abraham and said, what is this you have done to me? Why did you not tell me she was your wife? And why'd you say she was your sister? Go your way. And then verse 20, the last verse of the chapter. So Pharaoh commanded his men concerning him. They sent him away with his wife and all that he had. So again, we could, like the author of that CT article, say, Abraham's a sinner. Let's not do this. So one way to handle this story would be to moralize it and, to look up after you read it and tell your audience that we shouldn't act like Abraham. I don't think that's why the story's here. Again, I'm always amazed how little the text moralizes about things as much as it emphasizes other subtopics. If there's anything that I think, again, a Divine Council worldview would grab out of that story, would be verse 17. Because remember, Yahweh is a minority deity at this point. He is not well known. I mean, Abraham met a Melchizedek, we're going to learn coming up, but otherwise you don't know of any other people in the world that worship this deity. And so when you go into this story, and he's heading down to Egypt, of course, Egypt has their own religion, their own set of deities. The Pharaoh himself saw himself as a son of the gods. At one point in the story of the pharaohs and the story of Egyptian religion, they get to that point. But when it says in 17, Yahweh plagued Pharaoh, our antenna should go up and say, wow, we have a deity that can actually do things. He can actually plague the king of a foreign nation. So something like that to me would be what jumps off the page. I wrote this in my margin as well, that proving that our God rules. A person may see in this story a precursor to the otherwise greatest event in Israelite history. Of course, that's the Exodus in Egypt, because you have numerous parts of this story that have the same phraseology, maybe just a word, like famine in verse 10, beautiful countenance in verse 11, that's said about Joseph. I may live because of you, 13, that's the story of Joseph, right? That his family lives because of him. Taken into Pharaoh's house, verse 15, treated Abraham well, as Joseph was. The Lord plagued Pharaoh. That's going to be the main theme, frankly, of Exodus, where God sends 12 or 10 plagues on Pharaoh. And the last two verses, go your way, and with his wife and all that he had, where again the Exodus from Egypt, the grand one, yet to come, will be a replaying of this. So maybe literarily you could enjoy this story as kind of a portent of things to come. Whether you would have seen this coming, again, I don't want to put too much on that. But to me, again, looking at 12 not as a lesson in morality, but as a story of which Elohim, which God, that being our theme, that it's a clear story there of this deity being stronger than the one in Egypt. So should we appreciate Abraham's wickedness? Absolutely not. Again, he lied about his wife, but notice how the story doesn't moralize on that issue. It capitalizes on the deity issue. So anything else before we leave chapter 12?
I mean, I think it's interesting that like you mentioned, like how we quickly moralize it. The way that, I guess now after all these years, I read this, it reminds me actually, it's a really kind of funny, it's actually more of a little bit humorous thing that kicks in for me, because you have right in the two verses before where Abraham pitches his tent in Bethel. He calls on the name of the Lord. He builds an altar. He's epitomizing the pious person. He's epitomizing the person that's like, yes, I am a worshiper of Yahweh, and he's doing the right, worship. But then once things get hard, he reacts in a very preservation mode. Don't tell them you're my wife. Make sure I live. They will totally kill me if they realize.
Right, and maybe he did not know much about Yahweh yet, and I think, and I forget if we've said this to each other or talked about this, but how much does Abraham really know about Yahweh being, a jealous deity, being a moral deity, all these kind of things that we learn in the story, and we easily retroject back into it. Maybe easy for us, but it would have been harder for him. So, I mean, it won't be too many chapters from here that God tells him to kill his son, and Abraham does what we wouldn't have done. I mean, if God came to me and said, kill your son, the first thing I would say is, well, the sixth commandment says don't do that. Yeah. And Abraham didn't have a sixth commandment yet. So when Abraham lies about his wife, I'm not trying to minimize it in the sense of saying, let's not worry, but I'm also giving him the benefit of, shall we say, he doesn't have a 10 commandments. He doesn't even know, my guess would be, he doesn't even know this deity that well yet. He knows enough to follow him. He knows enough to, to leave his home and to change worship. And maybe he knows a lot. Maybe I wish we knew what he knew, but I guess what I'm just nervous about doing, and I would never take it into the pulpit anymore if I was preaching, I would never moralize the story and say, don't do what Abraham did here. I would, obviously anyone reading it would hopefully catch that, but I don't think that's the main gist of the story as to why it's here. So
I think like what I'm trying to, like I was trying to say ultimately is that what I see in this is that I can actually empathize with Abram, right? Because his reaction, he went from piously worshiping Yahweh. I built an altar for him. And then he went into really a behavior that I don't I would not condemn necessarily, because I can see myself in a moment of fear and weakness doing the same thing. And I think that's actually what for me is interesting about this story about Abram, is that it humanizes him. It brings him back down to like, oh, he isn't the perfect pious role model that we've always pictured him in like children's Sunday school stories. But he's a guy who is genuinely afraid of what will happen to him as he enters a foreign land with a beautiful woman that he knows that other human beings have essentially murdered other people for that very same thing. And so he's expressing a concern that is very realistic. And that to me, that's what I find fascinating. And it's not so much about the moral issue. Like, it's obviously wrong that he did this. We can see that clearly. And I definitely understand that he did not know what Yahweh's morals were, his ethic code. But I think the story's primary focus is like, yes, he is still a normal human being. He's still learning at this. He's still trying to figure out who Yahweh is. And here's an incident where we see that, and yet Yahweh preserves him.
Yeah. I've often thought of David and others in the Bible, as you say, that are not perfect individuals. And here we are down on the earth talking about them. I wonder if they could hear of our conversations in heaven, and do they wince? Do they say, oh, not Bathsheba again? Why do you have to keep talking about this? And I think we would say to him as a group of humans, as you said there about Abraham, I appreciate this though. It's one thing to be, to have your bad side shown, or, to be exposed for the moral failure that you can be. And none of us like that, but I want to say with you, Mike, if I could say it to Abraham, I'm so glad you did this in one sense. I'm so glad you lived out a normal human experience that I can identify with. And I'd say this to David too, as painful as his sin was. I would even say, David, I'm thankful that I get to read about it, because now imagine if the alternative were true. Imagine if David was this Mr. Perfect all the way through. That would be a hard act to follow, and I don't even know if I'd want to get involved in trying to follow that kind of act. But the David that we meet in the Bible, and the Abraham we meet, is the kind of Abraham, the kind of David, the kind of person that we can emulate, again, because the question of the hour is he trusting in Yahweh as opposed to any other deity? And if he can do that right, and I can do that right, then I'm on the page with him, and I can keep following his story. So, all right, I'm ready for 13, if you are. Then Abraham went up from Egypt, he and his wife and all that he had, and Lot with him. Now, Lot is he's dropped into the story right here. Actually, he might have been mentioned back at the end of 12. I don't see his name there, but he is the son.
Mentioned at the end of 11.
The end of 11. Is he there by name?
I think
Terah, so. Haran, Nahor. I'm looking at the end of 11. Anyway, he is. Lot.
Verse 31.
Yep, 27 and 31. Both have Lot there. So Lot, we learned from earlier, he was, and he's mentioned earlier because he's mentioned here, I suppose, but he is the nephew, the son of Abraham's brother, okay? Abraham was very rich, verse 2, in livestock, silver and gold. He went on his journey from the south as far as Bethel. Now that name, and if I can drop the idea on you now, Mike, at the beginning of our next podcast, I'd like to begin with this question. Do you believe in divine portals? The idea that God uses human spots on the earth as places to show up. I'll just drop it there, but I'd like to start next time with that question. And it's because I just mentioned Bethel right here. Verse 4, to the place of the altar which he had made there at first. And you can draw a line right back to 12:8, where he had stopped at Bethel, which is Luz at this point. That's renamed by the editor, but it will be called Bethel later. But right now it's called Luz. And there, notice again, this is 13:4. Abram called on the name of Yahweh. There is that theme again. Which deity is he talking to? This will be repeated in 21:33, and then by others in 26:25 and so forth. So don't ever lose sight of, I would say, in a biblical story, calling upon the name of this deity, the name of Yahweh. Here'd be a great place, in fact, to put the name Yahweh. If you are into putting the name Yahweh back into your Bible, that's the whole point of this verse. Which one? So you'd almost need the name Yahweh there to make sense of what this means. Lot also went with Abram, with flocks and herds and tents. I'm sorry, did I cut you off?
Well, I just realized, I don't know why I never noticed this before, but this is right after the incident in Egypt. So Lot was with Abram and Sarah in this whole entire fiasco of seeing Yahweh plague or afflict the Pharaoh, and seeing what this God that Abram is worshiping. Because like, part of me is wondering, it's like Lot, it's like thinking, it's like, who are you worshiping?
Yeah.
And then now seeing of like, oh dear, this God he's worshiping is really powerful.
Well, and Lot will be, and I think we can do it now. I think it's fair to do it now. Lot will be one of these guys like, well, and I'd even say like a Solomon figure, where you wonder where his loyalty is, because by the time you get into 18, I'm just going to jump ahead. I think it's totally fair to do this. In other words, we've been given the name Lot in 1127. Okay, just part of a genealogy. Then in 13, we're going to get there, a story of Abraham and Lot dividing their flocks, right? But then you kind of lose Lot as a story until you move into chapter 19. And specifically, you get to 19:12. The men said to Lot, have you anyone else here? He's living in Sodom. Yahweh has sent us to destroy Sodom. I'm in 19:13 now. And then they bring him out. I'm just going to jump ahead. Verse 24. The Lord rained brimstone and fire on Sodom and Gomorrah from Yahweh out of the heavens. And he overthrew those cities, all the plain. Verse 29. And God remembered Abraham and sent Lot out of the midst of the overthrow when he had overthrown the cities in which Lot had dwelt. And you wonder, where does this go, or what's the point of it? You get all the way in. Again, I'm always nervous to go grab a New Testament verse and push it back into the Old. But if you go to 2 Peter 2, verse 7, he brings up Lot, and he does it this way. God delivered righteous Dikaios Lot, who was oppressed with the filthy conduct of the wicked. And then he repeats it, 2 Peter 2:8. For that Dikaios man, that righteous man dwelling among them, tormented his righteous soul. Third time it said, from day to day by seeing and hearing their lawless deeds. Then the Lord knows how to deliver the godly out of temptations. This story of 2 Peter, interestingly, and again, does Peter know the story better than us? Well, I'd certainly give him first dibs on that idea. But even if he doesn't know of the inner workings of Lot, the idea that Lot can be righteous and still living in Sodom, participating in Sodom, and having to be rescued ultimately from Sodom, and then he has, and let's save chapter 19 for when we get there. Couple things, again, to a divine counsel worldview, make my antenna go up. And that is, we're not trying ever in the story to moralize or deal with the sins of a person to determine if they're righteous or not. We're not asking, did God forgive him, or did he sacrifice enough, or did he, whatever. In other words, we're not dealing with that kind of a question. The only question, and I can't emphasize that only enough, is which deity did Lot worship? If he worshiped Yahweh, would that have been enough for a Peter, for example, to look back upon this story? And we're just beginning it now, of course, in Genesis 13, really. Do we know enough about Lot to call him righteous? Peter thought he did. And it's just, again, where did he get his information? I'm not sure. But now let's read. So thank you, Mike. The point is that Lot is with Abram, that maybe we could presume that coming out of Egypt, Lot had gained the same worship pattern that his uncle did. And that this whole story, again, as we go forward from here, is not about who is right and wrong, but it's the story of two men who both worship Yahweh and who simply divide their herds based on what's in front of them. Okay, so let me read it that way, because to me that makes better sense, that we're not dealing with a good or, like a bad guy here. We're dealing with a righteous man in the sense of worship, who, yes, will make a wrong decision. But that's, again, to be expected based on how other righteous people make wrong decisions as well. So I'm ready with 13:5. Lot also, who went with Abraham, had flocks and herds and tents. Now the land was not able to support them. Again, they're just renting, sojourning, but they have a lot of herds, that they might dwell together, for their possessions were so great. Verse 7, there was strife between the herdsmen of these two men, and Canaanites and Perizzites. Then, that's the third use of that little particle az, A-Z in Hebrew, which is a time marker. And again, it's trying to tell us, notice again the story that God, Yahweh, is a patron deity of Abraham, and I would even say Lot, and that these men can presume then, and the writer is presuming, we are dealing with other people who worship other deities living in the same land at the same time. So this is going to be a cosmic issue, and that's why when I turn my page to chapter 14 and I have a war that Abraham's a part of, or a strife at least, that, again, we're dealing probably in cosmic issues here and not just people battling over land. The Canaanites and Perizzites then dwelt in the land. It's not an empty place that Abraham and Lot are working with. Verse 8, Abraham said to Lot, please let there be no strife. We are brethren. Verse 8, again, I think Abraham saw his nephew like he saw himself. At least it doesn't say that they're worshiping the same deity, but again, I'm presuming that based on how the story goes. Is not the whole land before you? Please separate. And I'm not, again, going to go through it all, but Lot looks up. He sees a nice watered land, verse 10. And like the garden of the Lord, there's probably a reference to paradise of Eden. Yeah. And then verse 11, Lot chose for himself all that plain, journeyed east. They separated. And Abram dwelt in the land of Canaan. Again, this is where the Canaanites dwell. So it's a man who worships Yahweh settling into the land that he does not own, and frankly has been given, back to chapter 11, to the authority of other deities. And Lot dwelt in the cities of the plain and pitched his tent even as far as Sodom, which has ominous overtones, clearly. But the men of Sodom were exceedingly wicked and sinful against Yahweh. Now there we go with a kind of which God do they worship. They're clearly not. They are wicked. And that is a term often, the wicked are not so. This quoting from Isaiah, the ungodly and the righteous are the two opposite ends of the pole in Psalm 1. The idea that wicked, again, more than just morality, but it's I would say a worship issue, and they are sinful as well. And Yahweh said to Abram, verse 14. After Lot had separated from him, lift your eyes now. And here's again, if you read this with a divine a cosmic geography in mind, to me this just screams out or off the page. Lift your eyes now and look from the place where you are, north, south, east, and west. For all the land which you see, I give to you and your descendants. This is a which Elohim question. Who has the power to grant land to a person? It would only, in their mind, it would be a God. Can I turn to, I'm going to do this in front of everybody, Judges. One of my favorite stories, Judges 11. It's the Jephthah story. And not to get into it deeply, but Jephthah is dealing with the Gideonites or the Ammonites. Yeah, the Amorites. Judges 11:23. So now the Lord God of Israel has dispossessed the Amorites from before his people Israel. Should you then possess it? And this is Joshua's argument to an Amorite about how to handle a land squabble. Verse 24, will you not possess whatever Chemosh, your God, gives you to possess? So whatever the Yahweh God takes possession of before us, we will possess. To me, I love 11:24 of Judges for its very swift and almost blanket idea that you can use so many other places, including Genesis 13, where two guys are disputing about land, and one says to the other, well, Chemosh gave you your land. Yahweh gave me my land, so what's the squabble? And it does seem to solve it probably, or by the way, in Judges 11, they go their way. So take that idea, and I don't think this is overdoing it much at all. The idea that in the ancient world, at this point, when you stood on a piece of property and you wondered, how did I earn this? Who gave this to me? Well, you may think in terms of your tribe. Ultimately, you thought in terms of your deity, and that's who owned it. That's who gave it, frankly, to your tribe. So for Abraham in 13:15, for all the land which you see, I give you and your descendants forever. That is a stunner of a statement. This is God putting up his hand saying, hello, I'm the one who runs the world, and here's how I'm going to show how powerful I am. I'm going to take care of you and your descendants, olam, into the ages. We say forever, but we can often take that word just to mean as far as your eye can see. So I've been talking a while, Mike. Anything you want to jump in with at this point?
I mean, it's cool and very, very neat for me to see as we're going through the story, because I keep thinking about, years ago I read Dr. Daniel Blox's book, Gods of the Nations. And I loved his hypothesis, which was that the Canaanites, the ancient Near Eastern nations around Israel, they thought of their gods were territorial, and that the primary relationship was that the gods had a relationship to the land. And doesn't matter who was on the land, but if you happen to be on that land, you are now the property of that god.
Right.
Versus when you compare it to Israel, Israel's connection to Yahweh was directly Yahweh to his people, not necessarily to the land of Canaan. That wherever the people went, there was Yahweh. And that was in a very stark contrast to the way that most people thought of their relationship with their gods. That they essentially were coming onto the land, and now we are enslaved to you because we are happen to be on your land. We have to go by your rules. Versus Yahweh here in this moment to Abram is simply saying, no, I'm your God, and you're my worshiper. All this land, no matter where you are, like that's incredible. Of just like how different and what a kind of a paradigm shift that has to be for Abram to realize. Right. So wherever I go, you are still with me.
It does, and it does remind me of David when he's running from Saul. Remember this in 1 Samuel 26. He's frustrated that Saul has said, you have to. He's running from Saul, and in 26:19 of 1 Samuel. They have driven me, David's talking, out this day from abiding in the inheritance of Yahweh, saying, go serve other Elohim. The idea of going across a border and being under the authority of another deity would have been Saul's thought. And now David, I think, can think above that, but and he knows his God is greater than that. But it's interesting that he quotes the Saul side when he says, you're driving me out of Israel to where I, quote, have to serve other deities. That's what they thought David would have to do. And I think David under his breath is saying, no, that's your quote. I'm quoting you. And so, of course, a lot of the Psalms are going to relish the idea. And even Solomon knows this when he makes the temple in 1 Kings 8, and he prays that God is too big, quote unquote, to ever dwell in a building or even a land. But the idea, again, that This to me would be, as again, a divine counsel worldview issue. To me, I settle in on a Genesis 13:15, and I circle it and say, here it is. This is the worldview. If you want to be really blunt, it's where one deity can tell a guy, I'm going to give you this land forever. I have that kind of power, and I'm going to be giving you not just a land, the land to rent, but to own forever. So. It's interesting in 1940, coming out of World War II, when the UN was given the problem of Israeli refugees, Jewish refugees that, were kicked out of Germany and frankly out of most of Europe. And they were wondering, where do we place these boatloads of Jewish emigrants who have nowhere to live, and they thought about Argentina, they thought about Brazil, and so forth. But they came back to Genesis 13, really as a UN, because they thought, and this was the Zionist movement back in the 1800s as well, that if Israel or if Jews are going to be given land by the UN, or if Jews are going to live in, quote, their land, well, their land is Canaan, So as politically expedient as it was or wasn't, of course, the UN vote was divided, but they were given in 1948, was it May 15th, 1948, the land of Canaan as their territory today, which they still possess. And of course, the next day, most Arab countries around them struck war with them over that very issue. And I think that's why, again, I'm talking out of my suspicions here. I have no proof for this, but to me, a Israel-Arab debate about land, I feel like, personally, I think it still gets into spiritual issues, cosmic geography. And again, I have no proof about it. Many Jews are atheists to this day, ones that live in Israel. But is there something about the land that is, in other words, if it was just political, then why would Arabs be so opposed to Israel having that land? I think there is something going on there, but again, I can't think divine thoughts. I'm I'm created in the divine image, but I still think very human thoughts. So I don't know more what to do with that, but anyway, nothing more than I can add to, verse 17, I will give it to you. I probably should bring this up now. I was in a class once where the student raised her hand and said to the teacher, "Do you see Jesus in this verse?" And of course, the teacher said, "I'm not sure what you're talking about." And well, she said, "Well, 14. Northward, southward, eastward, and westward. What is that? That's a cross. Jesus' cross is predicted in 13:14, to which the teacher was kind and said, "That's interesting." And we all say, well, finding Jesus in every verse might be an interesting spiritual exercise. I personally find it to be more challenging than it need to be, because I don't think that's the goal of a story like this. So, I was just looking through Bibles on the half-price bookshelf yesterday at the store, and one of them is called the Jesus Bible or the Jesus something. And the point of the translation and the study notes is to find Jesus in every chapter of the Bible. And again, is that wrong? I would say it's an interesting thing. I just don't find myself feeling I need to do that. To understand the story of the Bible certainly has Jesus fulfilling an absolutely necessary and wonderful role. But I don't take that to mean that I'm to read my story left to right looking for its main character in every chapter. So I don't know if I need to say more than that, Mike, but is that fair?
It's kind of funny, the fact that you just mentioned that story. Like I was mentioning to you right before we started recording, was that I've been reading this book, He Gave Us Stories. It's for my demon cohort coming up. And one of the interesting things that the author brings up is the need for, yes, the Spirit of God to be informing us and helping us understand scriptures, but at the same time, to also need to do actual study. Mm-hmm. Not, right. And that he points out that a lot of times, like when folks who are opposed to doing actual real study and research, a lot of times these kind of quippy, cute kind of thoughts may appear, and we take them so seriously because we feel that this was something that the Spirit of God had revealed. And so when you mentioned about how north, south, east, west, that it's an image of a cross, I was like, well, that's cute, but it could also be taken as all of the land. It could be like an idiom of just simply everything you see around you. It's not necessarily a cross. I mean, it's a cute idea, but I'm hesitant to even say that that's like what the Spirit of God intended, the authors and the editors of Genesis to put together of like, yes, this is going to lead towards the Messiah.
And it's going to be what Jews call midrash, where you go in and you playfully respect the text, but find things in it that may not have been there the first time around. And so Jews do it with their texts and Christians do it with their texts. So I guess, I wouldn't call it evil. I would call it, well, you use the word cute. I'm fine with that. You will be amazed, Mike, as you are leading a church and Bible studies and teaching, wherever you find yourself teaching, people will find things that you don't know how to respond. You say, oh, okay. And you don't want to poo-poo it. And yet at the same time, you kind of, well, what do I do? So I've learned to, and I'm sure I do it too, and I've done it. I'll never forget, I was heading off to I was a senior in high school. We're heading off to state basketball tournament and on the bus, and I'm reading my Bible and getting ready, and I'm so excited, and I don't know where, it's somewhere in the Psalms about leaping over a wall. He will help me leap over a wall. And I wrote the word dunk next to it. I was so excited that God would help me dunk during the state. Now I never did, but that's what the verse said to me, right? And so I still have that Bible. It's up on my shelf, and I love my old Bible. And I read that Bible from cover to cover the spring of 1979. I remember we had a challenge in our church to read our Bible that year, and I just got excited. I just read the whole thing. I motored it right on through between January and May. I was done really early. And in other words, I loved reading my Bible. But what I was looking for was stuff like this. That's how I read it. And I can go back in my notes today, and I can find things that I wrote in my margin that have nothing to do with what the Bible was talking about. But does God want your heart more than your head? Absolutely. Does he want your head too? Yeah, absolutely. So let's do it with both. That's not a problem. 13 ends with, again, I cannot stress it enough, although I've done it too much already. You can guess where this goes. And built an altar, the last line of 13. He built an altar there to Yahweh. So what is he showing, or what is the text showing? Obviously, Lot was more selfish than Abram. Abraham made a mistake in 13. He takes the high road, or he made a mistake in 12, lying about Sarah. He takes the high road in 13. But again, if we're preaching through this to an audience, go ahead and say that look up from the text and say, on a moral level, it would be good to give people like a nephew better territory. If you want, that's a nice thing to do. But again, is that the story? Notice the text doesn't do that. The text doesn't stop and say Abraham made the morally good choice. It just says Abraham went this way, Lot went that way, and built into the story is a man being kind. Excuse me, is a man being kind to his nephew. But what is the main point of the story is 15. I will give you this and to you and your descendants forever. A lot built in there, even beyond just a divine counsel thought. I've often wondered how, back in, this is 20 years ago now, but there was a debate about God knowing the future. You were just a young bumpkin in high school at that time, right, Mike? I don't want to date you, but back in the late 1900s and 2000, somewhere in there, the big debate was, does God know the future? And it was a hot topic at ETS. People got kicked out of ETS for it and all sorts of things, And I had the debate in my college classroom. I brought in the two main proponents in Minneapolis at the time, Greg Boyd on one side, John Piper on the other. They both came to my classroom and presented their case.
Wow.
And had a good time with it. And I'm not going to put either guy above either guy on this question. I'm just saying to me, the question of does God know the future would be the kind of question that would come out of a text like this as well. And you'd say, here's how I would put it. If God doesn't know the future, then how can he say this to Abraham? Or, other way around, if God gives libertarian free will to humans, as a rule, God doesn't involve himself in human free will decisions, if you want to go that far. And I know there's levels of that discussion. But if God is just giving out, is going into the biblical story and giving humans free will as a rule, saying, I'm not going to get involved. I want you to make those free will choices on your own. Then how could he make a prediction like this, that I will give this land to your descendants forever. You have a thought on that before I close up this discussion on my opinion?
Well, I remember a while ago when Mike was still, when Dr. Heiser was still with us, he made this interesting comment that I've always appreciated, which was, do we believe that God is big enough and smart enough, like smarter than all human beings and even other, divine beings, spiritual beings that he had created, that he can see all possibilities? And that by that fact that he has that knowledge of seeing all the possibilities play out, he can work through those situations to get to his ideal desired goal. Okay. And I thought that was brilliant. That is not like a decree edict and then thus everything has to somehow form into that way, right. But that he can maneuver and pivot infinitely to ensure that his will and his desired goals will happen. Right? And that my loyalty and my trusting and belief in him is that he can actually take care of me or take care of us or take care of his people. And he knows how to best do that no matter whatever will come. Yeah. And like that to me is like, that's an amazing concept of God, of he is way bigger and way smarter than any of us could ever fathom. So that to me is like, I think that's how I would approach that kind of issue of him being able to say, yes, this will happen. It is a prediction and he knows how I'm going to help make that happen.
how I'm going to get there. And, the reason I bring this up as we close 13 in this podcast is that to me, as we talk divine counsel ideas and be a clearinghouse of ideas for the divine counsel worldview, to me, this is a question that all comers can have and have their own view on. That, and I know Mike, very early on, in fact, in Unseen Realm, that he talked about free will, and that was Mike and I's first conversation, as I've told that story. Where we became fast friends in college because of a 7-hour conversation in the stairwell about free will. So we often battle that one out, but we did it with smiles and laughter, and he made fun of me and I made fun of him. So my point is that you can have either view, and if you're reformed in your background and you have a divine counsel worldview, you're probably not going to be so much on the free will side, right? That's just standard reformed thinking that God has more control than just allowing free will to run rampant. That's just generally part of that worldview. On the other hand, Mike was coming from an almost Arminian background where free will was this, kind of a standard. So my point is that as we bring up that kind of a question, as I did actually, that I'm allowing or kind of welcoming in both sides to say, hey, let's have this conversation. Because whatever way you go, as you just said, Mike, if God is going to tell a guy that his descendants will have this land forever, boy, that is, he's telling the future in a sense and also predicting it, somehow putting those two together. And thus the question of free will needs to get involved there. To whatever level it does, we still have a God who gets his will done. So I'm still one to be happily, sitting over the coffee cup with my opponent on this issue. I have no problem, and I'm even careful to call it an opponent. I would just say this is a wonderful philosophical question that every religion has dealt with, and even Christians have dealt with. Jews deal with it as well. The idea that can God not only know the future, but determine the future? Can he manipulate human agency to do his will, divine agency to do his will, blah, blah, blah. So that question will always be with us. It's a good one. It's a fun one. And I welcome all sides to a divine counsel worldview where that is not solved. So with that, anything else before we close it up? Again, remember at the beginning of next podcast, Mike, I'm going to ask you about the idea of a divine portal. So I'll give you some time to think about that, and then we'll go there next time. But anything else before we close up 13?
Well, two thoughts. And first is I did find it's interesting that after God reassures Abram, north, south, east, west, all this land will be given to you and your descendants. In verse 18, it says, Abram moved his tent and came and settled by the oaks of Mamre, which are at Hebron. And my Faith I Study Bible notes here remind me that this was the same place where where Yahweh appeared before Abram in chapter 12, verse 6. So he returns back to the place where he first met Yahweh. And the thing about Genesis is we don't get real clear timestamps. We just know that a significant amount of time has gone by. And he returns again back to that spot where he first encountered Yahweh.
I think there's something to that. Yeah.
Yeah. And to me, that's actually a very
story of Bethel as well.
Yeah. There's something very again, human and very appealing about that, of like a reminder to me that it's important as maybe as a pastoral application to never go too far away from, in some sense, where we began our faith, to always be willing to return back to the very first encounters and moments to remember, because those are foundational to the building blocks of our faith. And I find it moving that like he gets this beautiful promise from Yahweh that he didn't petition him for. He didn't ask Yahweh, like, will you give me this land? Instead, it's just out of the goodness and kindness of Yahweh's heart. And in response, Abram, like, I want to go back to the spot where I first met you. And that's like very moving. The second thing is just simply, as we're closing, I think one of the things I've appreciated in these conversations with you, Ron, is just that, you and I are coming from two different, probably different theological traditions, theological backgrounds. I've even heard, and I've liked to call myself at times like a theological mutt because like I'm
There's
willing to glean. I'm willing to glean from a lot of different traditions and also different perspectives. I think as we continue going into the Divine Council worldview, I think it's maybe a good reminder to just mention to the audience that as we encounter scholarly material, as the two of us keep on discussing, that we probably will not always agree on everything.
Right.
But there should be still always a sense of respect and camaraderie, and the fact that we are still coming there because of our loyalty to the same God, to Yahweh himself through his son Jesus.
Yep. And I come from a what I call myself a recovering fundamentalist. My friend at college where I taught called me a damaged fundamentalist. So I mean, that's up to debate. But I'm a very strict background, which I appreciate. I mean, in the sense I wouldn't wish it on anyone, but I wouldn't give it up for the world either, right? So the idea that I was taught a certain version of how to think about the Bible and such. Yes, that's my background. But so yeah, we're coming at it from different angles. But it's amazing how we're connecting at this point in our lives, anyway, with an understanding that we can put. And I think we both have done this in our past. I suspect we've taken off the judgmental hat and put on the curiosity hat. We're reading things, even books we disagree with, and talking with people we even disagree with, and going to conferences and listening to papers we disagree with, not judging why we think they're wrong. That's not our first thought. We're doing it out of a curiosity of how does this person's view help me understand the Bible better? I may not agree with it, but that doesn't matter. I'm not judging him or her. I'm simply saying thank you and moving, to the next stage in my own thinking, be it a different direction or the same. So there's a lot of reasons why people change their theological views. That's a whole podcast in itself, wouldn't it be? Why do people change their theological views? My path has been, it's usually because I'm up against a wall. I have to defend something, or I teach at a school and have to say something, or I teach in a denomination and I have to take this stand on this verse. And when you find yourself backed up into a corner theologically, and then you start to read, and not only what you agree with, but what you don't agree with, and there that moment of time where you look at a text and say, I think I'm going to have to go this way, even though I've been taught that way. Those moments are very memorable to me. I'm sure they have been for you. And it would be fun to hear how that has affected our audience too. And for me, a lot of divine counsel discussions or pivot points in the text came from that sort of, I don't know what I should say here. I think I should say this, but I think the text is saying that. And that's taken some time, but over time, that's why we call this a worldview. And that's why Dr. Heiser was convinced that this is not just an idiosyncratic view of certain texts. This is an entire worldview by which you not only, as Lewis defined the sun, by it I see everything else as well. I see it, and in other words, I believe in the sun because I see it, and by it I see everything else. And that's kind of how I see the divine counsel worldview. I believe it's there, and by it I see the text opening up in ways that are so helpful. So, well, let's call it a day on Genesis 13 for the sake of having a stopping point, and we'll pick it up in 14 next time. Thank you, everyone.